Good morning, and thank you for joining us for today's event. I'm Christopher Skaluba, the director of the Transatlantic Security Initiative here at the Atlantic Council. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion on women, peace, and security in shifting security landscape. Today's event is co-hosted by the Atlantic Council's Transatlantic Security Initiative and the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. In Our Secure Future, Women Make the Difference. The Scowcroft Center works to develop sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and its allies and partners. We honor the legacy of General Brent Scowcroft, his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership in cooperation with allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. In keeping with this mission, our Transatlantic Security Initiative shapes and influences the debate on the greatest security challenges facing the North Atlantic Alliance and its key partners. Our partners for today's event, Our Secure Future, Women Make the Difference, was founded to strengthen the women peace, Our partners, Our Secure Future, Women Make the Difference, was founded to strengthen the women, peace, and security agenda to build a more peaceful world through ensuring women's full participation in governance. The organization works to ensure the effective incorporation of gender perspectives into the peace and security decision-making at the national and international level, which leads to greater security for everyone. Today's event kicks off the Atlantic Council's International Security Women's Day week-long programming, as we reflect on several critical milestones, including nearly 25 years of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security, as well as NATO's 75th anniversary. The discussion will consider emergent geopolitical challenges should be addressed and prioritized through a gender lens to strengthen collective security and defense alliances. This event is part of the Transatlantic Security Initiative's 2024 NATO Washington Summit campaign. For more information and updates on future events and publications, follow us on Twitter at AC Scowcroft. Today's conversation will be moderated by Sahana Damapuri, Vice President of Our Secure Future and Vice President of Pax Sapiens. Before we turn to our panel discussion, however, I am pleased to introduce our keynote remarks provided by Special Representative for Women, Peace, and Security at NATO, Irena Faline. Over to Irena.
Dear participants, allow me to express my gratitude for the opportunity to address you today on the occasion of this timely discussion organized by the Atlantic Council alongside Our Secure Future on women, peace, and security in a shifting security landscape. While I regret that I cannot be there in person, I am keen to share with you my thoughts on this crucial subject. Today's discussion holds particular value as we reflect on two significant milestones, NATO's 75th anniversary this year and the nearly 25th years anniversary of the United Nations Security Council resolution on women, peace, and security. These milestones serve as a poignant reminders of our collective commitment to advancing gender equality, promoting peace, and ensuring the security of all individuals, regardless of their gender. As we sadly know, Europe is not at peace. We find ourselves in a security environment defined by strategic competition, perceived instability, and recurrent shocks. The unprovoked aggression of Russia against Ukraine violated the norms and principles that once contributed to a stable and predictable European security order, shattering the peace that many took for granted. Terrorism, as the most direct asymmetric threat, poses a significant challenge to the security of our citizens, and it is an impediment to international peace and prosperity. Women increasingly face threats to their rights globally, and they continue to face barriers to full and meaningful participation in peace and security processes. The principles of our Resolution 1325, adopted 24 years ago, are not only yet to be fully implemented, but indeed increasingly challenged. Authoritarian and terrorist actors exploit gender narratives, which are reflected in their tactics to divide and destabilize. Russia's deliberate targeting of civilians and destruction of civilian infrastructure in Ukraine highlights the severe consequences of these actions. Women and girls remain target of multiple forms of violence, including gender-based violence, conflict-related sexual violence, exploitation, abuse, and trafficking. We also face numerous cross-cutting challenges. One of these is climate change. As more and more research and data reveal, women and girls experience a distinct impact from climate change, which amplifies existing gender inequalities and poses unique threats to their livelihoods, health, and safety. Embracing new and emerging technologies offers opportunities to create a more gender-equal world. But we must also be vigilant against technology biases and gender disinformation that risk exacerbating gender inequalities and violence, undermining stabilities and threatening our core values. NATO once again recognizes that the significant impact that instability, crisis, conflict, and post-conflict situations have on women and girls. This shifting security landscape underscores the need for a comprehensive and strategic response. We firmly believe that the complexity of the geopolitical challenges we face today demands a nuanced examination throughout a gender lens. In line with this commitment, NATO allies have resolved to update the NATO WPS policy, set to be endorsed at this year's summit in Washington, D.C. The new policy will set a clear vision for the advancements of NATO's WPS agenda, allowing the alliance to better navigate current threats and challenges and to contribute to a more gender-equal future. We aim to deliver a new policy that better reflects our strategic concept, which already underlines gender equalities as a reflection of our values as an alliance, and the integration of the WPS agenda across NATO's three core tasks: deterrence and defense, crisis prevention and management, and cooperative security. WPS is as relevant now as it has ever been. Resilience in face of this ever-evolving security environment requires the active involvement of all segments of the population, including women and women's civil society organizations. They play a vital role in preparing for, resisting, responding to, and quickly recovering from strategic shocks. Exchange with civil society organizations is vital to prevent that we work in silos and to ensure that NATO's approach to WPS aligns with the global WPS agenda. This is why in January we have opened the consultations with the newly nominated Civil Society Advisory Panel, better known as CSAP, and integrated the policy update as a major part of the first annual meeting. The CSAP, functioning as an independent advisory body external to NATO, offers critical perspectives from the very grassroots of society. These insights play a crucial role in helping us identify pitfalls and preventing blind spots. NATO acknowledges that women are often at the forefront of efforts to support societal resilience, mediate conflicts, and build peace. In addition to women's valuable contributions to all peace and security efforts, their full and meaningful participation in decision-making and the implementation of solutions related to all aspects of peace and security are critical to achieving NATO's mandate and promoting peace and stability in the Euro-Atlantic area. As we confront today shifting security landscape, it is crucial to uphold NATO's values, reinforcing alliance unity and readiness to protect citizens, defend territory, safeguard freedom and democracy, and work toward a just, inclusive, and lasting peace. I extend my best wishes for a productive and insightful panel discussion. Thank you for your commitment to advancing women, peace, and security in these challenging times.
Thank you so much, Chris and Irene, for helping us set the stage for today's conversation ahead of International Women's Day, March 8th. We have a very wonderful and thought-provoking conversation ahead of us, and I'm really glad to share the stage with my colleagues here. My name is Sahana Dharmapuri. I'm the Vice President of Our Secure Future, Women Make the Difference. We're really excited for you who are watching and all of you in the room today with us. I want to begin by quickly introducing our panelists and then jumping into the conversation. First, I'd like to introduce Jenna Ben-Yehuda, who's the Executive Vice President at the Atlantic Council. She has previously served as the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Truman National Security Project and the Truman Center for National Policy. We're also joined by Melanie Nazir, Vice President for Advocacy and External Relations at the Women's Refugee Commission. Ms. Nazir and her team share Women's Refugee Commission's research and recommendations with policymakers, media, and supporters to the wider public and in the U.S. and at a global level. We're also joined by Ms. Maura Whalen, Director for Democracy and Technology at the National Democratic Institute here in Washington, D.C. In her role at NDI, Maura helps bridge the gaps between technology, policy, and democracy, and is a regular contributor to the global conversation on fostering a digital ecosystem that supports democracy worldwide. Thank you, ladies. It's really a pleasure to share the stage with you and really appreciate your thought leadership in this area. So we heard remarks by Ms. Feline about the NATO upcoming summit and some plans of integrating women, peace, and security more deeply into NATO's priorities. But John, I'd like to start with you to maybe give us some reflections, but also maybe contextualize the 75th anniversary summit that's going to be held here in DC.
Well, thanks, Sahana, and welcome back to the Council. It's great to be here with everyone today, and a special thanks to our Secure Future for your partnership. We're really delighted. It's and in many ways, it feels somewhat like full circle moments. We have a series of anniversaries this year, right? We're coming up on the 25th of the Resolution 1325, which kind of ushered in this movement of women, peace, and security, and with it, the national action plans that followed from member states around the world. We have, of course, the 75th anniversary of NATO coming, and Washington will host the summit this summer, a date that we're tracking very, very closely here at the Atlantic Council because we'll play a really important role with the Public Forum, which is the civil society convening for that this summer. So, and we do so, of course, amidst an open war in Europe, a war which is in Ukraine, but is in many ways a war that is being contributed to, supplied by many countries around the world, the United States not least. So the backdrop against which we're having these conversations, I think, is one of particular urgency and poignancy because of Russia's war in Ukraine, which is really, I think, Russia's war with the West more broadly. We also have with that the accession of what I think of as two especially critical WPS NATO accession moments with Sweden and Finland. And we think in particular, of course, about former Foreign Minister Margaret Wallström's legacy of a feminist foreign policy in Sweden. And even though it was, of course, revoked recently, I think it was in 2022, we know undoubtedly that there is this legacy of feminism's integration with the security movement in Sweden that I think will become a part of this conversation as they enter NATO. And likewise with Finland, huge legacy of women's equality and gender-based equity as movements. So curious to see how the accession of these two member states changes the complexion of some of this conversation. But it's an important moment, and especially as we hopefully begin to eye Ukraine's reconstruction over the horizon, important to remember to have those voices at the table for not just the war fighting, but the peace table as well.
Thank you. I'm going to jump to Maura. So in your reflections, I'm curious because of your work on democracy and democracy promotion and technology, what your reflections on Ms. Feline's comments on, Jenna was just talking about the increase in multilateral alliances, et cetera. Love to hear your perspective.
And thank you, Sahana, for having me join you today. It's always a pleasure to be here with two of my favorite organizations, Our Secure Future and the Atlantic Council. And I think the remarks, what stood out to me is the transition over those 75 years and this evolution of watching one of the most enduring multilateral organizations in the world really embrace this concept of multi-stakeholderism, which is inherently women, peace, and security, of the full participation of all people in decision-making to make us more secure. So the absolute redefinition of security. And as we're going into, we're a quarter into this year of more elections in the world than we've ever seen before, and the threats to democracy, both on the periphery of NATO, but also in the Balkans, from authoritarian actors in Asia. we're seeing a rise in the need for all of us to pay attention to these issues, especially around emerging technology, not just in the information space, where we see women's full participation being chilled in elections and in their ability to access information, but we're also seeing it in increased cybersecurity threats, increased threats to surveillance. So the very tools that democracies, that NATO is using to potentially help make us more secure can also pose a threat to 50% of the global population in particular. So these conversations can't be more critical than coming to the table and figuring out how we rectify those differences, how we ensure that we, over time, in trying to protect ourselves, in trying to secure the direction of free enterprise, free societies, we don't destroy that from the inside by increasing the use of these technologies to threaten our very security that we're trying to achieve.
Yeah. Melanie, I mean, you work on a lot of these conflicts that we're talking about from the women's refugee perspective. What are your reflections on some of the, Irene talked about the inclusion of civil society voices. How much of those voices do you think are being included in the conversation?
Well, thanks. Just going last, like echoing everybody's thanks. Probably do that in a shorthand way. Really great to be with you, Sahana. Always appreciate your partnership, and great to be at the Atlantic Council. I'm pretty new to WRC, so just a great way to kind of kick off my tenure here. In terms of, first of all, yes, super important that WPS has the recognition that it has in NATO and in the upcoming summit. I think where we really see some challenges are in two areas, and I hope we have time to talk more about them. One is related, I think, to what you said about, in the interest of protecting women, because they face so many security threats, particularly women who are displaced by conflict and crisis, we kind of default and use that as an excuse to exclude them from leadership because we want to prioritize keeping people safe. So that's a real issue that, and there are some solutions. Women are doing amazing things around the world, particularly forcibly displaced women, refugees, women who are displaced by conflict and crisis. But they need our help and support, and we need to kind of follow their lead because they have excellent recommendations and ideas of how to build peace. So again, saying it is great, and there have been many strides over the last 25 years, and including women in decision-making and following the lead of women. But there is so much more that we can do from the kind of mundane. Women cannot literally be at the table if they can't get on the bus because it's too unsafe for them to get on the bus to go to the meeting, right? So it's things like that that address women's security. Unless women are safe, we're not going to have security, and that's particularly true of people who are displaced. So that's one point. And then the other one is, this is actually not really an anniversary, but we're pretty close, so I'm gonna throw it in there, is the anniversary of the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees, which followed World War II, which is really our framework for protecting people who are fleeing persecution. It doesn't address all of our modern challenges. It addresses a very specific, we talk about climate refugees, that's not really, we know what that means, but refugees is actually a legal term. It was established in the 1951 convention, applies to people who are fleeing persecution based on their race, religion, nationality, membership in a social group, or political opinion. So that's what a refugee is. And the 1951 convention obligated states to protect refugees and put some requirements on refugees themselves on how they must comport themselves. But basically, it's about states protecting refugees. And what we're seeing now is kind of a race to the bottom. We have this massive crisis. We have millions of people and millions more who will be displaced by conflict, by climate change, by the conflict that comes from climate change. And we're taking a very deterrence enforcement only approach. So some of the recommendations will be, including women in addressing some of these challenges, and the world kind of coming together in a more kind of coordinated way to address these challenges that aren't, walls and blockades, because we know that's not going to work.
Yeah, I think what you've all said really underscoring the fact that okay, now we know it's almost 25 years for women, peace, and security. Now we know we need to have women at the decision-making table. And for a lot of good reasons, but it's not quite happening. But this multilateralism, this push towards multilateralism and strengthening alliances can really be an entry point for that, particularly NATO being a leader in women, peace, and security and advancing the goals. I think this is an interesting point maybe to turn back to you, Jenna, about how can NATO better integrate these perspectives? You know, they are talking about creating new policy, asking these civil society groups to add their perspectives. But can you give us some examples, or, you know, how are these countries actually doing this?
Well, I think, you know, there are a number of important points raised here, and Rena begins to address some of this. I think having civil society's voice structurally included in these conversations is a really important one. I think NATO, like many multilateral institutions, struggles a bit with opacity and not having its processes and its own diplomacy be accessible to external parties. So extending a logical and structured entry point for the women, peace, and security agenda into NATO, I think, is an important part of this. The other piece of this is that, you know, so much of the dialogue around NATO right now has been about reaching that 2% GDP threshold commitment for defense spending. One of the things that we know from our WPS work is that, as Hillary Clinton would say, it's not only the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do, right? And if you're talking about a moment in which you address, we have this unprecedented level of, we have a global refugee crisis in many respects, and a tremendous number of people forcibly displaced and on the move at a time when globally our institutions are unable to meet that demand. That is especially the time to ensure that these resources are used really wisely. And we know that by including women in these decision moments, not just because they're disproportionately impacted by conflict, but also because they are the key to durable peace, it also needs to be a part of the way that we think about resourcing when it comes to addressing these crises. And I think this is one of the important roles that our Secure Future and so many other organizations plays in reminding these organizations of the not just the rights-based imperative, but the fiscal imperative to equity. So I think that is a big part of what will be on the table for conversations around NATO as we approach the 75th.
So you want to see not just, you know, a commitment to women, peace, and security, but some signaling and resourcing at the summit, at least a discussion about that.
I think it's on people's minds because the resourcing question has so dominated this war in Ukraine. We're in the midst of our own U.S. congressional continued battle over funding this Ukraine supplemental as European and NATO partners continue to try to reach their own threshold commitments and things of that nature. We need to be thinking about how we continue to provide for security, not just in a conflict phase, but in a reconstruction phase. And as we look at the data and we know that women at the table in these moments of conflict and also at the peace table creates a more durable and long-lasting peace, that is one element of addressing this resource-constrained environment.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. You know, something else you have mentioned, all of you have mentioned, is the role of women as agents of change and of advancing the rules-based order. And Maura, I'd like to turn to you about this because your work is in the democracy and technology field. I think it would be really interesting for our audience to hear more about how women are leading some responses to some of the threats that you had raised earlier.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that has been very positive about a lot of these dynamics is that when we look at the technology space, we saw governments often be late adopters to understanding both the opportunities and the threats of social media. Now that we're in this age of looking at generative AI, we're seeing governments respond very quickly to the point where we have 50, 60 global conversations happening about the issue right now. And at the heart of that is the bias that we know exists in the data sets that are both used to protect us, but also used to help create the information space we want to see. So one great example of where we're seeing forward action is in the Global Partnership for Action on Ending Online Harassment and Abuse. There are 14 member countries, many of them are NATO countries, and they're working together to redefine the space, first of all, to give us definitions around issues like gender disinformation, but also then saying, what do countries need to do? We can't have this be the people versus technology companies. States do have a responsibility, but we need to help shape the future. And I think that's it's going to be both an opportunity and a challenge for organizations like NATO, which is inherently defensive, to look at what is the outcome we want? What does a durable peace look like? And how do we acknowledge, for instance, in the information space, that it's the harms done to women around gender disinformation happen online. This isn't about going from online to offline, right? And do we see what we see on our social media pages then reflected in the streets? This is about the chilling of the conversation, the stalling of peace, the spread of disinformation around democratic systems that's happening online. And so what we're going to need, and what we see women doing around the world, is leading in that conversation. We can point to Ukraine, where we saw one of the most durable countering disinformation efforts to authoritarian actors, predominantly led by women, in looking at those threats. We see it in Taiwan, which is a secondary and major concern of NATO, where we see threats coming to Taiwanese businesswomen, Taiwanese political leaders, and the threats they're experiencing threatening the full participation of women. This is all by design. So I think we have to look to a lot of these overlapping alliances of the Global Partnership, of the Freedom Online Coalition, and look at opportunities where we can build on each other's energy to everyone establish their swim lanes, in a sense, do what they're best at, and work together but having a clear understanding of where we're trying to get to. So that means not just riots in the streets, or we're all secure and safe in our houses as we duck and cover, but really that we're able to freely participate in elections and political discourse and be actively driving forward to an inclusive society and the inclusive democracy that NATO and other organizations stand for.
Thank you. You know, you mentioned some concrete examples from Ukraine and Taiwan. Would you mind giving one of the examples just as an illustration for the audience? Because I think sometimes it's hard, like we hear disinformation, we hear women's movements, we hear, this is where we show agency, but what does that look like?
So, and this is hard, right? Because this is where I think about I'm reflecting on the fact when NATO first went online with social media companies, and now we're seeing social media companies being a constituency and part of how NATO brings companies to the table, right? In a way that we see defense contractors in the defense industry be. But even at the Munich Security Conference, we saw companies coming to the table and talking about elections. But in real terms, we saw the former president of Taiwan regularly attacked for her relationship status, for her the way she led and the approaches. And these things are often difficult for algorithms to pick up. They're challenges to identify, but they're gendered, right? Yeah. And it's used to undermine leadership, undermine confidence among the population. And that's really the goal. And I think what we've seen over very quickly, actually, in diplomatic time, right? Over the past 2 or 3 years, we've really stopped looking at this and saying, but is that just the price of doing business, of what women face by being leaders in this space, and moved to looking at it as a systemic problem that authoritarian actors are using to undermine the leadership of women, which is, again, not just aimed at that one woman, in this case, the president of Taiwan, but also to undermine the participation by other women because they're chilled. They don't want to experience that same harm. And it's working. That's why they do it. And what we're doing by protecting ourselves and protecting that participation, in that case, throughout the Balkans, throughout Europe, is really draw attention to creating the type of democratic information space we want to see, and putting the actions both from companies, from governments, and global alliances into play so that we can create that.
Yeah, so I think what I really want to underscore from what you said, what I'm hearing is it's very clear that democracies, the kinds of alliance that NATO is interested in, the countries that are joining, are supporting a rules-based order where everyone can fully participate in a democracy, whereas authoritarian regimes are actively targeting women in particular, and women in leadership positions in particular, not just to undermine the individual woman, but to really undermine a rules-based system of democracy. That's what I'm hearing.
Absolutely, and we've seen this happen with European leaders as well, where right as they're on the verge of joining NATO, all of a sudden videos come out questioning leadership and undermining that confidence. And I think we need to be able to step back and realize what we're seeing, that it's not salacious gossip, but it is a national security agenda.
Thank you. You know, moving from that, this actually really connects, in my thoughts, to what you said earlier, Melanie, about this default of us looking at women as victims when actually they are agents of change and have a really powerful recommendations to address a lot of these issues. I think we'd really love to hear from your perspective, particularly from the Women's Refugee Commission, what you're hearing from women on the ground and some of the recommendations that have come forward.
Sure, and I just want to say it's so interesting because we're looking at completely different things, right? But the themes are exactly the same. It's this kind of intent to marginalize women, marginalize civil society, keep the engagement as, I think that's so interesting. I didn't make the connection so much before, but now everything that you're saying, I think, applies even more to women who are forcibly displaced. Yes. Whether they are, activists and advocates, or whether they are women in their communities, far from everything that they know, all the people and institutions that they trusted, trying to make a life for themselves in a place where they might not have legal status, might be a constant risk of, refoulement, which is the term for returning people who face persecution, or being returned to a place where they can't feed their families, where they've relied on crops for generations or even thousands of years that all of a sudden are failing and can't be a source of. So all of those risks and all of that instability, and layered on top of that is kind of the gender issues of lack of access to health care that's specific to women, lack of protection from gender-based violence, and then layered on top of that is the demonization of migrants, of refugees. And when the world sees countries like ours do it, countries that, and I will have to kind of disagree, it's not that we don't have, some of us have the capacity to absorb refugees and migrants. The US, countries in Europe, it's a challenge, but we have resources, we have the capacity to integrate, we have jobs, we have volunteers who care about these issues. What does it look like to the rest of the world, like countries like Chad, where it actually is a fight for resources that we're saying no more. We can't handle it, we're not gonna welcome you. And a lot of that does fall on women. Now, investing in women and women-led organizations makes a huge difference. Because when you invest in women, it pays many dividends. Women are the ones who are responsible for taking care of their kids, who are investing in the communities, who are often tasked with doing a lot of the work. And so some of the things that we can do, particularly in terms of women-led organizations, Ukraine is a great example. We have WRC and HIAS are sponsoring a delegation of Ukrainian activists for the Commission on the Status of Women that's going to be in New York for the next couple of weeks, bringing them to high-level meetings. We're paying for it ourselves. We're two little NGOs. Paying for bringing 7 amazing activists to talk about issues affecting women and LGBT refugees that have fled Ukraine. There's so much capacity around the world in countries that don't have the high level of developed civil society like Ukraine has that we're just not investing in. And all of these organizations need what any of you who work for NGOs need: flexible, multi-year funding that's sustained, that trusts leadership. We need to, like I said earlier, get them to the table. do what it takes to create the situation where they're safe and secure and they can come to the table and participate. Leadership pipeline, training, all of that stuff. It requires a lot of resources and a lot of coordination, but this is kind of the forum where maybe we can make some progress there.
And when you are thinking about, okay, we'll have the NATO summit this June, where would you like to see the voices of women refugees come in? What kind of priorities do you think that they would like to put on the table if they were involved?
Well, I mean, it goes across all of the NATO priorities, right? Conflict prevention, rebuilding, recovery, all of those things. Refugee women, and I'll say broader, forcibly displaced women, because not all women who are displaced are refugees. I mean, there are many millions of people now that are being displaced for other reasons, can really talk about the impacts of climate change, the insecurity that leads to, what they're doing in their own communities to try to make lives better for their families. Investments like, in healthcare. How do we most effectively deliver healthcare? WC has done some research on, health, community-based health providers, where in a conflict where there aren't doctors and nurses available, how do you train local people to provide those services, particularly to women? So there's all kinds of ways, and all of this, from the big to small, leads to more security for women, and therefore more security. I mean, there are no more, conflicts and migration it's not at the border anymore. It's global. So all of this really should be a priority for for global security. Yeah.
And it sounds like, but from all of your comments, actually, what we need to think about and what women's lives are showing us is exactly what you just said, that security isn't just about borders and territory anymore. It occurs, insecurity occurs online, which has no borders. What you were talking about, there's no sort of, we can be safe over here while you're unsafe over there.
Yeah, that's just not the reality anymore, right?
Yeah. So Jenna, I think what would be really interesting to hear is what would be some key recommendations for NATO to take under consideration in this regard?
Yeah, it's so interesting as we reflect on how the nature of warfare has really shifted. I was in India last week for the Rasina Dialogue, talking a lot about gray zone conflict, and we have we are far past the days of armies coming over hills and having a symmetric warfare planned kind of conflict. We have so much of this gray zone conflict, which is shy of war, but right of cooperation. So we have this wide spectrum of conflict that has expanded dramatically. And Maura's point in particular about the increasing nature of online conflict, I think, is where NATO has some room for growth and reflection. NATO, like other multilateral defense cooperative institutions and individual nations, is coming to grips with how do we think about security in this online space? How do we think about it?
Yeah.
And how do we approach security in a multilateral sense in an online space? These are really tough questions. Where are borders? When it comes to weaponized AI and cyber attacks and things of that nature? How do you think about escalation? How do you think about proportionality? We know also that women are at the forefront of online abuses, especially from far-right governments, militia groups, terrorist organizations. The nature of how these viral moments catch online, what they're being done, whether it's the president of Taiwan specifically to degrade the leadership profile of a senior leader, or by and large to stoke the kind of fuel the flames of online hate, which are bleeding into interpersonal violence in the real world. It's something that I think is going to be a really important strategic question for NATO, especially as we get into the proliferation of large language models. And we know that these AI and these more sophisticated generative models the data is only as good as what is contributed. And women's voices are marginalized online. Women write far fewer pieces. You can just look at the Wikipedia articles. I mean, women's voices online are not representative of women's presence in the world. So as we begin to think about how the nature of that bias becomes literally and figuratively encoded in our security systems. These are the kinds of big questions that our security alliances, NATO first and foremost, really need to take into consideration as we think about the future of warfare and its second and third order effects, especially for women.
That's really interesting because I think it's really directly related to the origin of women, peace, and security, where women were saying post-conflict, we want to be part of the Constitution writing. We want to be part of the institution building and the design of the world that we want to live in. And what you're saying is basically we're in the same point now in the digital ecosystem, really with tech and technology companies and with multilateral alliances like this one.
I think it's true. It's kind of a yes and. You know, we have so much conflict that is not going to result in a physical gathering around a peace table in the way that we once might have. And so it becomes incumbent upon us to think about all those opportunities for buy-in, for voice, for decision making. It is so much more fractured and diffuse that having a comprehensive strategy to approach that becomes really critical. We used to have a moment when we thought, okay, we have structured peace talks. Who is coming to these talks? When I worked on the National Action Plan many years ago, it was really thinking about a physical moment, a convening of peace. We don't have a lot of moments like that because so much of the nature of conflict is that gray zone kind of conflict that is short of war. So how do we think about women, peace, and security in this era of the proliferation of gray zone conflict? I think this is something we've got to contend with.
Melanie, what are your thoughts on this?
I'm not sure. I don't even know if I remember the exact question.
Well, really, if you want to go back to key recommendations at the NATO summit, if you could be.
I mean, I think, you know, the biggest, and this has been something that, you know, advocates for refugees and migrants have been saying for many years, is that, you know, security does not equal deterrence and enforcement. And security doesn't mean, again, fortifying borders, building fences. Security involves talking to civil society, particularly women-led organizations that can talk about the issues that directly affect them and that they've been actually engaged in trying to address because nobody else is coming to help them. So I think, you know, if we continue down this path of kind of ripping out the foundation of our modern humanitarian law, which is the 1951 Refugee Convention, we're just going to lead to more chaos. I mean, you know, more migrants and refugees arriving in Europe, at the US border. I mean, that is a globalized phenomenon. I mean, it's not Mexicans at the US border. I mean, it's some, but it's mostly people from all over the world, Chinese, Ecuadorians, I mean, everywhere are converging at our borders, and that's also true in Europe. So I think it goes to what you're saying, is this is a very globalized, kind of chaotic phenomenon with no international cooperation beyond deterrence. And we need much more engagement of civil society, of women-led organizations, refugee-led organizations to come up with some real solutions to build peace and to keep, you know, and to kind of maintain more of an order. Because when you have chaos, that's what invites fear, and that's what makes societies kind of reject the newcomer, demonize the newcomer. And it's all because nobody likes that feeling of chaos. It doesn't feel like there's any kind of comprehensive approach to dealing with it. And I think it's a real, I mean, we're at a really critical moment how the world is going to respond to this.
Maura.
Well, I'll be a little bit optimistic in that there is a secret sauce. I think if we have organizations like NATO and others acknowledge that we are doing it wrong if we limit conversations to Brussels, Washington, and Silicon Valley, and we open up and realize that the most effective solutions we've found, much like WPS and the evolution of WPS, come from the women in the Global South who have developed plans, developed strategies, who have redefined security in their own sense, who have seen it first, seen the problems happen first, identified them long before others got there. And we can look at this and say that the guns and bombs on the borders and the kinetic things we see on the news, we all know there's a lot going on underneath there. And we can look at another anniversary. We've been talking about a lot of them, but the recently passed anniversary of the resolution of the conflict in Northern Ireland, at the women who provided the common ground for how to redefine security at a very local level, because I think that's another point. But this is a growth edge for all of these organizations, to include NATO. Going back to the beginning, we heard about new efforts to bring in civil society to have these consultations, but we've got to redefine that whole relationship and bring more people to the table. It will look like it takes time. It will feel, as raucous and messy as democracies can often feel, but it ultimately is what makes us develop the resilient solutions that are going to lead us to the durable peace that we've experienced thus far. So the world is changing. It's great to see NATO and other organizations recognize that, but developing the mechanics to address it, I think, are a major gap that we shouldn't leave behind 50% of the world's population as we do that.
Yeah. So I do want to get to Q&A, but I want to end with this question for all of you, which is, what has surprised you the most about this, working on this issue, women, peace, and security?
I'll start. How hard do you have to fight to just get in the room? And that's another Hillary Clinton. Imagine what we could do if we didn't have to fight this hard to just get in the room. And it would be great to spend less of my time admiring problems and more of my time solving them.
Okay.
I have one.
Yeah.
Just thought of. I don't want to say surprised, but completely inspired and awed by the resilience of women who continue to engage in this despite the challenges. Unimaginable persistence in the face of, again, especially thinking about the population that we are mostly concerned with, just forcibly displaced women. In the light of all of that they're facing, again, lack of legal status, demonization, gender-based violence, all of those things, and worrying constantly about their kids and lack of employment, all of those things, that they show up, that they go to the meetings, that they find each other, that they make progress. Again, I don't know if I want to say surprising, but I think it's something we should all keep remembering, that as frustrating as it is living in our messy democracy, and as worried as some of us may be about kind of the future of our own country, these women just every day, with what they have, they put everything into kind of making their communities safer. So again, not surprising, but something that we should keep at the front of our minds.
Thank you.
I don't know. I'm a little surprised that we're having some of the same conversation that I feel like I've been having for 25 years. So on the one hand, it feels impossibly slow. On the other hand, having just returned from the Munich Security Conference, everybody knows what women, peace, and security is. And everybody knows why it matters. And it is not the same. We're still having the conversation. We have to keep having the conversation. But there's much less education that is happening. And so I do feel like, okay, I will concede the point. I think there has been progress made. I'm just impatient, and I want more of it faster. But these things do take time. That said, I met with so many female heads of state in Munich, so many women chief of defense, so many ministers for whom this is an obvious part of their strategies and is integrated. It's not their first national action plan. It's not their second. It is a part of the fabric of the way that they're doing their kind of strategy work. As we continue in this moment where we are thinking about democracy on its back foot, and this contest and this pressure of authoritarianism around the world, we have to remember that equity and inclusion are enemies of authoritarianism.
Yes. Yeah.
And so this is not a conversation that is just for women. This is a conversation for all peace-loving people and for all societies who seek security and durable access to livelihoods and peace and prosperity. So it feels more urgent than ever before to get this right, because it is also an insurance policy against the societal underpinnings that bring stability over the long term.
Would you say that when women are bringing up issues of, many of them that you've talked about in conflict or online, that in fact these are early warning signs that NATO and others should be taking into account? Because as you're saying, this is a moment that we're in. How can we better integrate those early warning signs into the conversation that's coming up in NATO?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can look at any society and the way that it treats its most vulnerable as an indicator of what kind of cleavages exist more broadly, where the trust deficits lie, where those kinds of cracks exist that might be exploited by aggressor powers. It's certainly a warning sign. I think there are a lot of really strong voices at the table now. And as we think about the cost of war relative to the bargain of peace, we have to be attentive to those kinds of signals as we hear them more increasingly.
Okay, great. I'm going to try to move to Q&A. We do have a few minutes. Let me take a look and see what we have from the audience. Okay, let's see. Well, this is a little tricky, but I think you guys can handle it. What has NATO learned from the current situation in Afghanistan, where decades of efforts to promote women's rights and security have failed? How does NATO view Pakistan's role as a non-NATO partner in promoting peace and security, or women's security in the region? I think that also goes to, I think that question, the reason why I chose that is because it goes to also, we have partners in the Indo-Pacific region, or countries who want to be partners of NATO. And I think this challenge of working in conflict zones with allies and partners, or places where we don't have partners in protecting women's rights, is a good one. So what have we learned, or what can you say NATO has learned?
Specifically with respect to Afghanistan?
Yeah.
You know, in my experience working with host governments on conflict stabilization efforts, I think the one lesson that I've taken away is that, that peace is most durable, the change is durable when there is strong buy-in on all sides. Countries have to want it. There has to be a local, strong constituency that's committed to that. If you look at the successes of a Plan Colombia, and you look at the nature of that country's commitment to securing its peace, they outspent U.S. Efforts by a long shot, and there was a broad-based civil society commitment to that peace. For all of the extraordinary work that has been done in advancing the right of women and girls to school, to access to education, so many other things in Afghanistan, which is heartbreaking to see how quickly that has receded. I think what we are missing, and there's so many things that are lacking, but is a broad-based commitment locally to enshrine those rights. There is only so much that can be done to force that kind of change externally. We look at all of the money that was expended there. It's tremendously heartbreaking. I think so many of us who've worked on Afghanistan issues over the last 20 plus years feel that really, really deeply and personally. But I think that kind of durable change has to require some kind of local ongoing commitment in order to ensure that it's sustained. But
I was just going to say, I think there's a lesson in questioning the word culture and what is allowed to take place in the name of culture. and cultural understanding. And we saw in Afghanistan where that meant the repression of women. We see that around the world. And I think if we're going to take a lesson away, it's maybe just to start with that and question it when you first hear it and see it as a decision maker, and not accept it and not allow it to go by, is a really first, just have that moment, let the hair go up on the back of your neck and know what you're seeing, and know that maybe you need to look at policy options that will allow us to avoid what Jen is talking about.
Oh, no, I don't have anything to add. I think those were pretty complete answers, yeah.
Yeah, I think, well, I might add my 2 cents here on NATO. I think one thing that the women of Afghanistan did give to the rest of us is the importance of having a gender perspective in security.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because I think that that is something that didn't exist before that time we had in Afghanistan. And I think it's more, as you say, more familiar to people. We don't have to necessarily do a lot of explaining about women, peace, and security. We do have to get more people to do it.
That's right.
Right. Yeah. I think we have time for just one really quick question, or yes, not that quick, but maybe a little bit of a couple of examples maybe about disinformation and gender. We had a question about examples from Ukraine, but I think any examples would be really useful.
And I hesitate on this because I'm always like, to protect the women involved, I don't want to exploit it, too much. But we see, I recently returned from Kenya, where I was able to do a consultation with groups of civil society women who are engaged in this and looking for solutions. And I would point to some local political leaders that we see there who are regularly attacked for their marital status, for their religion, for their abilities as a mother, and very little about their public record. There's another legislator that we work with often in Tanzania who talks about when the agenda becomes my gender. We've missed the point. And then you can talk about some higher profile cases like Maria Ressa, one of the winners of the Nobel Prize, who regularly was experiencing online abuse and having her voice repeatedly silenced. So the moral of the story is that this is affecting women very locally, very personally. And for NDI, we look at Iraq, we look at Afghanistan, where it was the #1 issue is, we train a lot of democratic activists. We go around the world helping them equip themselves. And it's the #1 reason that women say they're not going to run. It's the threats of violence they know will come, but it's the online abuse that is the deterrent because of what it does to their families, what it does to their ability to earn an income, what it does to their personal reputation and credibility, and how hard they have to work just to have a voice. So there's way too many examples to count. And I think the other thing to note is that the women we've seen on a global scale who've experienced this in Europe, or I'm thinking of Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, this isn't what they want to spend their time talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
And they want to talk about the issues. I'm thinking of many people in the refugee community forced to confront this not only within their from transnationally from authoritarian actors, but also locally and among local leaders. They don't want to talk about their gender in this space. They want to achieve peace outcomes and secure outcomes.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I see that we're out of time for more questions, but it's been really a pleasure to have each of you and have this time to have this conversation. We had so many other questions that hopefully we'll get to another time. On behalf of the Atlantic Council and Our Secure Future, I'd really like to thank all of you for your attendance and your participation in this conversation, and I hope that we have more. It's been really a pleasure to moderate, and I encourage you to stay tuned to future WPS events like this one, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.